What if I told you the money in your bank account isn't really yours? You see a number on a screen, a promise of security, a symbol of your hard work, but that number is an illusion. It's a story we've all agreed to believe in. And throughout history, that story has ended the same way, every single time, with betrayal, panic, and ruin. Every government swears its currency is safe. Every empire insists its promises are eternal, and they are all lying. The question isn't if the system will fail, but what will you be holding when it does? Because the financial virus that has toppled empires for 2,000 years is alive and well, and it's coming for everything you think you own. For the people of Lebanon, the nightmare is already here. Just a few years ago, Beirut was called the Paris of the Middle East, a hub of finance and culture. Citizens had their life savings in modern, stable banks. They were doctors, engineers, and teachers who did everything right. Then, in 2019, the story changed overnight. The banks locked their doors. The ATMs went dark. The numbers on their screens were still there, but they were meaningless. Their savings were frozen, trapped behind a wall of political promises and financial lies. The Lebanese pound lost over 90% of its value. A lifetime of work evaporated into thin air, stolen not by a thief in the night, but by the very system that swore to protect it. People were seen literally breaking into banks, not to steal money, but to beg for access to their own. This isn't ancient history. This is now. And this modern horror is just the latest echo of an ancient ghost, a pattern of deception that began with the greatest empire the world has ever known. 2,000 years ago, the Roman Empire held the world's most trusted coin, the denarius. It was pure silver, a symbol of power and stability accepted from the fields of Britain to the markets of Persia. It was the dollar of the ancient world, unshakable and eternal, or so everyone thought. But emperors have expensive tastes, and wars aren't cheap. When the silver started running out, they found a solution not in conquest, but in corruption. They began a secret, insidious process called debasement. A little less silver here, a bit more cheap copper there. At first no one noticed. A coin was a coin. But slowly the poison spread. Merchants started weighing the coins instead of counting them. Foreign traders demanded better payment. The trust that held the empire together was dissolving, one diluted coin at a time. The Roman economy rotted from the inside, leading to runaway inflation, civil unrest, and eventually collapse. The people who held onto their debased coins saw their wealth turn to dust. The ones who survived were those who quietly hoarded real assets, land, gold, and goods. Rome taught the world a lesson that echoes to this day. Governments, when desperate, will always cheat their own currency. But centuries later, France would teach a far more terrifying lesson, that even with the best intentions, a currency backed by dreams is just printed air. The French Revolution wasn't just about overthrowing a king. It was about building a new world based on liberty and equality. To fund this dream, the revolutionary government issued a new paper money, the assignat. It was supposed to be safe, backed by the vast lands they had seized from the church. It was a symbol of progress, but the temptation of the printing press proved too powerful to resist. When they needed more money, they just printed more assignats. Soon, there were mountains of paper, chasing a shrinking supply of goods. Prices exploded. A loaf of bread that once cost pennies now cost a fortune. Farmers refused to sell their crops for worthless paper. The markets ran empty. The government that had promised freedom delivered starvation. By the end, the assignat was so worthless that people used it for wallpaper. The revolution that was meant to empower the people had financially destroyed them. The dream of a perfect paper currency had turned into a waking nightmare. And while the French learned that promises on paper could be deadly, the bankers of Florence had already revealed a different kind of betrayal. One that proves the phrase, "too big to fail," is a lie as old as money itself. In the 14th century, Florence was the Silicon Valley of its time. Banking families like the Bardi and Peruzzi were financial titans, lending vast fortunes to kings and popes across Europe. The biggest client was King Edward III of England, who borrowed colossal sums to fund his war with France. Then, in 1345, the unthinkable happened. The king simply defaulted. He refused to pay his debts. The result was a financial nuclear bomb. The Bardi and Peruzzi banks, the largest in the world, collapsed almost overnight. Confidence vanished. Trade ground to a halt. The entire European economy was plunged into chaos. The ordinary people of Florence, who had trusted their savings to these mighty institutions, were wiped out. They learned a timeless truth. When the powerful fall, they drag the trusting down with them. Jump forward nearly 700 years to 2008. The names weren't Bardi and Peruzzi. They were Lehman Brothers, Bear Stearns and Merrill Lynch. Once again, financial giants, deemed untouchable, crumbled under the weight of their own reckless bets. And once again, it was ordinary people who paid the price, losing their homes, their jobs, and their pensions. The pattern is unbreakable. Trusting your entire future to a single institution, no matter how powerful it seems, is a gamble that history has proven you will eventually lose. But human greed and political failure aren't the only forces that can shatter an economy. Sometimes the threat isn't a king or a banker, but something far older and far more terrifying. In the mid-1300s, a force of nature unlike any other swept across Europe. It wasn't an army or a revolution. It was the Black Death. Within 5 years, it wiped out nearly half the continent's population. It was a catastrophe of unimaginable scale. Cities became graveyards. Fields were left untended. The world seemed to be ending. But out of the ashes of this horror, a bizarre and powerful economic reset began. With half the workforce gone, the value of labor skyrocketed. For the first time in centuries, peasants and craftsmen had leverage. They could demand higher wages. Land that once belonged to noble families sat empty, and those with even a little silver or savings could buy it for almost nothing. The rigid social order cracked, and wealth was redistributed on a scale never seen before or since. The Black Death didn't just kill people, it rearranged power. It was a brutal lesson that crisis doesn't just destroy, it transfers. Wealth flowed from the unprepared to the liquid, from those who owned titles to those who held tangible assets and skills. This brutal reset exposed a hidden law of economics. But what happens when a nation does this to itself, intentionally? During the American Civil War, the Confederacy was fighting a war on two fronts, one with cannons and rifles, and another quieter war with the printing press. Desperate for funds and cut off from gold reserves, the Confederate government printed money, the grayback, with reckless abandon. This currency was backed by nothing more than the hope of victory. As that hope faded on the battlefield, the value of the grayback disintegrated. Inflation became so extreme that it was effectively a joke. A soldier's monthly pay couldn't buy a single pair of boots. People started carrying their money in wheelbarrows to buy a loaf of bread. By the end of the war, a Confederate dollar was worth less than a cent. People burned it for warmth. It was a painful, accelerated reenactment of what happened in Rome and France. The winners were not those holding on to patriotic paper, but those who held things the government couldn't print: land, livestock, tools, and food. Every one of these stories, from Rome's silver coins to the Confederacy's paper bills, feels like a chapter from a distant past. But the virus hasn't been cured, it has only mutated. Today, it lives in the digital realm. In 2023, Americans watched in shock as major regional banks like Silicon Valley Bank collapsed in a matter of hours, triggering a panic that proved modern banking is just as fragile as it was in 14th century Florence. During the pandemic, governments around the world didn't just print money, they created trillions of dollars with a keystroke, flooding the system and triggering the worst inflation in 40 years. This isn't a bug in the system, it's a feature. It is a silent tax on your savings, a digital debasement happening right before your eyes. And now, governments are floating a new idea: central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs. A currency they can track, program, and even delete. It's the ultimate form of control, dressed up as progress. The pattern is undeniable. From the debased coins of Rome to the worthless paper of France, from the defaulted debts of kings to the frozen accounts in Lebanon. The story never changes. Money is trust, And that trust is always eventually broken. The systems we are told to believe in are designed to fail. And every failure is a massive transfer of wealth from the unsuspecting public to the prepared elite. The next great financial reset isn't a conspiracy theory. It is a historical certainty. It's already in motion. The only thing we don't know is the date. So look again at that number on your screen. Don't see it as wealth. See it for what it is. A temporary promise in a long line of broken ones. And then ask yourself the only question that matters. When the music finally stops and the illusion shatters, what will you be holding in your hands that is real?